What are you afraid of? We're all afraid of something. I was afraid that no one would miss me while I was gone, and it was good that someone said to me something very nice today. They said, I was afraid you were never going to come back, which was nice to hear because I was afraid I would hear, I was afraid you were coming back. So there's a lot of fear in all of our lives. I think we're all familiar with fear. Fear is a normal part of the human experience. In fact, a measure of fear is appropriate. It's necessary. Fear protects us. Fear guides us. Fear prevents us from saying too many times in our life, here, hold my beer and watch this. Fear kind of puts warning signs on our life. And in some sense, fear is a part of the normal human experience. And Jesus understood that. There are many times when he says over and over to his followers, he says to his disciples, he says to us, he says, don't be afraid, fear not. Because he knows how frightening the world is that we live in. And he knows how powerful fear is. That's why fear can become a weapon in the hands of a bully. Fear can be something that when it is used in an abusive fashion, when fear overwhelms us, it can paralyze us, it can petrify us. Fear can be destructive. Fear can bully us. Fear, when it overwhelms us, is a bully. We're in the middle of a 7-week conversation about the biography of one of the most significant people in the entire Bible, one of the most important people in the Hebrew Bible. And in fact, his story takes up 1/3 of the entire first book of the Bible. The book of Genesis has over 350 verses dedicated to the story of a man named Joseph. He was of royal lineage. He was from the royal family of Israel. He was the great-grandson of Abraham, the grandson of Isaac, and the son of Jacob. And he was a man who was influential in guiding the nation of Israel and the character even of our faith. And we've been wandering around in the life of Joseph for a number of weeks, and we're going to stay there for a few more weeks, looking for some insight into what does it mean to live a life of faith in a culture, in a community, in the context of bullies. We live in a world with far too many bullies, and what does it mean for us to live a life of faith in that context? And we're using Joseph as our guide, Joseph as an example who lived a life of faith among the bullies. And today we're going to talk about how Joseph faced his fears. And hopefully what we'll learn, what I hope to share with you today, are some observations about how we can push back when fear begins to overwhelm us. When fear begins to bully us, how can we push back on it? How can we get out from under those fears that would bully us? But before we talk about that, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to comfort us and challenge us, to encourage us, to push back against the bullies of fear in our life, and to remember that you've got this. You've got us. I pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we go any further today, I really want to thank Pastor Todd Mears and Pastor Doug Congdon and his wife Lee. Did you appreciate them being here the last 2 weeks? I really hope you did. really hope you appreciate the high quality, the high performance, high value staff that we have here at Riverbend. The folks that are investing in this community professionally are the best that I have ever served with. And having Doug and Todd and Lee here over the last 2 weeks enabled me to get away with my wife for a few days. I have to tell you, we had a few days to ourselves. We went to Vegas. We had never been to Vegas before, and that's the weirdest place I have ever been. It's adult Disney World. It's just crazy. I still haven't sorted it out in my head. But I also had a chance, thanks to their filling in for me, to take my new son-in-law to visit my parents at their rest home in North Carolina. Doesn't that sound like a great trip? Go with your father-in-law to visit his parents. I like saying I have a son-in-law. I really like the idea that now he's responsible for one of my daughters. But I took him, and the two of us went to North Carolina, and he did really great. What I didn't realize about Jeremy was that he's really good at Wheel of Fortune. And in a retirement community like that, Wheel of Fortune is a big deal. I mean, they don't even call it Wheel of Fortune, they just call it wheel. The wheel is on. And I didn't know he was really good at this. So he won my parents over in spite of the tattoos and things, and they were like, what is that, what? That was good, but that was thanks to Doug and to Todd and to Lee. And I know they might have stretched some of you, they might have pushed the boundaries a little bit, they might have ruffled some feathers, but I'm proud of them for that. And I trust their hearts, I hope you do too, and I hope you realize what great hands the future of Riverbend is in with them and their teams and the folks that are investing in our children and the children here in our community. But as they guided us through the story of Joseph, I want to kind of catch up with where they were in case you, like me, missed the last few weeks. The story of Joseph is the story of a guy who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was, in fact, the golden child. His father identified him as his favorite child, as his favorite son. And just so that everyone would know that this was his favorite son, he gave him a technicolor coat, the coat of many colors. This did very little to endear him to his 10 older brothers. In fact, his 10 older brothers, quite reasonably, hated him. And when I say they hated him, they didn't just dislike him, they hated him. One day, when Joseph was 17 years old, he went to visit his brothers out shepherding their large flocks of sheep in a village called Dothan, and his brothers ambushed him and threw him into a pit. They faked his death and sold him to slave traders, to human traffickers called the Midianites. The Midianites took Joseph and carried him down to Egypt, where they sold him as a slave to the household manager of Pharaoh, a man named Potiphar. Now, what hopefully you learned from Todd and from Doug and Lee over the last few weeks was this was a tough go for Joseph. These were tough times for him while he was sold into slavery, but God was blessing him. God was with him. But during that time, when he was serving in Potiphar's house, Potiphar had a cougar for a wife, and she had her eyes on young Joseph. And she made a play for him with Joseph, which Joseph rebuffed, and when he did, it hurt her feelings, and she accused him of inappropriate sexual conduct, and her husband then threw him into Pharaoh's dungeon, where we pick up the story of Joseph. Things are not going well. He is incarcerated unjustly in Pharaoh's prison. Now, much of what I observe about the life of Joseph is not the things that he necessarily does, but the things that he doesn't do. Not necessarily the things he says, but the things that he doesn't say. It's interesting that if you read between the lines, particularly of this story, this chapter of the story, in the 40th chapter of Genesis, you make some observations about living a life of faith in a culture of bullies, because Joseph is unjustly incarcerated in Pharaoh's dungeon. We don't know how long he was there. We only know that for some time, a matter of time passed. It could have been months, it could have been years. Joseph may now be in his early 20s. He may have been hopelessly incarcerated for years at a time, but at some point in his imprisonment, two men were thrown into prison with him. One was the chief baker of Pharaoh, and one was the chief cupbearer of Pharaoh. They had done something to get crosswise with the Pharaoh of Egypt. They may have fed him something inappropriate or offered him something inappropriate that he didn't like or wasn't suiting to his taste, or maybe he was paranoid and he thought they were trying to poison him. But for whatever reason, he threw the two of them into his dungeon with Joseph. It's an amazing commentary about Joseph's life that while he was in prison, all of the guards, even his enemies, admired him. And so when these two men, the cupbearer and the baker, were thrown into the dungeon with him, he was given charge over them. We don't know how long they lived together in this incarceration, but after some time, the two men, the cupbearer and the baker, on the same day had very similar dreams. You ever had one of those dreams where you wake up and you're not sure whether or not it was actually real? Sometimes it's kind of nightmarish and you wake up and you're glad that it didn't happen. Other times the dream felt so real, you're kind of disappointed that it wasn't true. You ever had one of those dreams that linger? They obviously had a dream that really upset them. And interestingly enough, Joseph notices that they were bothered by something. Now, that's quite remarkable on his part. You have to be very empathic to notice someone who is in a dungeon having a bad day, because every day in a dungeon is a bad day. It's not like fishing, where fishing is better than any day. Dungeons are worse than any day. And he noticed that even in the dungeon, even in their imprisonment, these guys were having a bad day. And Joseph says, "Hey guys, what's going on? What's wrong? Why the long faces?" They said, "Well, we had this dream, both of us. Each of us had these dreams, and they're really bothering us, and we can't shake them, and there's no one to tell us what they mean. There's no one to interpret them for them." And Joseph says, "Well, of course there's not. Human beings can't interpret dreams. Only God can interpret dreams. Maybe you should tell them to me. See what God tells me about your dreams." Well, first of all, the cupbearer tells Joseph his dream, and he describes these three vines. He said there were these three vines that grew up. And all of a sudden they budded and they bloomed and they bore grapes, and the grapes ripened. And when the grapes ripened, I saw myself squeezing the grapes into a cup, and then I gave the cup to Pharaoh. What do you think that means? Well, almost immediately Joseph said, "Well, I can tell you what that means. I can interpret that for you. The three vines represent 3 days. 3 days from now, 3 days from today, you will be restored to your place of giving the cup to Pharaoh. Everything will be just as it was before. In just 3 days, you'll be released and you'll be restored." That's really good news. But I want you to know that when that happens, don't forget me. Remember me. Remind Pharaoh that I have done nothing to be put into this hellhole. That I was a kidnapped Hebrew teenager, and I have done nothing wrong. So don't leave me in this hole. Don't forget me. Well, the chief baker overhears this interpretation of the cupbearer's prophecy, and he's like, "Oh, do me next." And so he says, "Here's my dream." Okay. And he says, "Well, I had this dream, and there were 3 wicker baskets on my head. And they were filled with the finest bread and the finest pastries, like I used to make for Pharaoh. And there were birds. They were flying out, and they were picking at the bread and flying around. It was amazing." I don't know what the look was on Joseph's face, but he probably paused for a moment and said, "I can tell you what that means, if you really want to know what that means." He probably said, yeah, tell me. He said, "Well, in 3 days, you too are going to go before Pharaoh, and he's going to cut off your head and put it on a stick. And birds are going to pick away at your bones." Not exactly what the baker was hoping for, you think? This is not good news. As it turns out, 3 days later was Pharaoh's birthday. And Pharaoh threw a banquet for all of his servants and all of his household staff. And he sat at the places of honor, the 2 men he had thrown in prison, the baker and the cupbearer. And I'm sure in some dramatic fashion, he announced to his gathered guests that the accusations against the cupbearer were false, and the cupbearer would be restored to his position of serving the Pharaoh. But at that same banquet, he announced that whatever crimes the baker had committed, he was guilty of, and he had him executed, beheaded, had his head put on a stake, and the birds did pick at his bones, just as Joseph had said. And the story ends in one of the most frightening sentences in Joseph's life. After the cupbearer was restored to his place of prominence, it says he didn't give Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. What is your worst day? What is the darkness, the tragedy that you've experienced? What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of a situation like that again? Are you afraid of the tragedies or the difficulties or the struggles in life? I think we all have fears of those things. Well, Joseph had those fears. I don't know about you, but if my life had taken the trajectory that Joseph's life had taken, he was certainly born with privilege. He lived until the age of 17 as his father's favorite. He lived as the son of a great patriarch. But ever since that time, everything that could possibly go wrong has gone wrong. He was betrayed by his brothers. He was beaten. He was thrown into a pit. He was sold to human traffickers. He was sold as a slave in a foreign country. And even though God was with him and God was blessing him, he was lied about. And he was deceived, and he was unjustly convicted and thrown into a prison. All of these things happened to him, and I don't know if it was you, but if it was me, I'd have a bit of bitterness. I would be harboring some fear in my heart that this was the new normal. And things like doubt and discouragement and difficulty with my situation would be my attitude, but we get no indication whatsoever that this is how Joseph conducted himself. You read through the story of Joseph in prison with the baker and the cupbearer, and you get no indication that he had any anger or bitterness or fear at all. And so as I read through that story, there are some lessons that I take away from this, that I'm trying to learn as I read between the lines, as I look at not what Joseph says, but what he doesn't say. Not what he does, but what he doesn't do. And the first lesson I come away with is that Joseph was not afraid. He was not afraid of his circumstances. He did not let his circumstances bully him into doubt. He did not let his circumstances bully him into doubt. The story makes it very clear that Joseph is fully aware that his life sucks. When he describes his situation, he says, I am a kidnapped Hebrew. I don't belong here. I don't deserve to be in this hole. The charges against me are false. Everyone has betrayed me. I have done nothing wrong. And yet, when he is given an opportunity to show evidence of whether or not he has abandoned his faith, whether or not he has given up on his God, whether or not he is overwhelmed with doubt, he says, no, I believe that God is with me. When they ask him whether or not these dreams can be interpreted, he says, no, it's only God that can give the interpretation. Tell me, because God is with me, is what he's saying. You see, when we're thinking that our circumstances and our situation will never change, and we're afraid of our circumstances, we're afraid of the future, we're afraid that the difficulties we are in is the new normal, don't let fear bully you into doubting that God is with you. Don't let your fear that things will never change, that things will never get better, that this season of struggle will never end, don't let that bully you. Don't let that fear bully you into doubt. I mean, what kind of faith did Joseph have anyway? What was Joseph's faith about? I mean, Joseph lived thousands of years before Jesus ever walked the earth. Joseph lived before the law. He lived before Moses. His faith was basically a faith that there was a God, and that was it. He had generational input and stories and narratives that had been handed down through the generations. But I like to think that Joseph looked around at the world that he lived in, and he saw the beauty and the wonder and the majesty of it, and he said, well, I'm not going to worship the tree. I'm going to worship the one who designed that tree, who made that tree. And even when I don't understand it, I believe there is someone, there is a God that explains all of this. And that's the one who I'm going to trust. That's the one who I'm going to worship. His faith was a simple monotheism. He just believed that there was a God, and that the God would make sense of all of this. And in the fear of his circumstances, that his situation would never change, he was not bullied by that fear that caused him to doubt or to be angry with God. I think we overcomplicate our faith. We want to know everything. In fact, I think we know too much. We don't realize how simple our faith should be. That there is a God who loves us, and there is a God who has it under control. When I was a little kid, I used to love climbing around in our barn. We had this big barn. It was 3 or 4 stories tall and had a real tall hayloft. And up at the top of the barn were these hand-hewn beams, and I would climb around up there. And my mother and my grandmother would always yell at me. And if you had a mother or a grandmother, you know what they said. They said, don't go up there because you'll fall and you will break your neck, break your back, put out an eye, or kill yourself. Any one of those 4 injuries were the standard injuries that would happen if I fell into the hayloft. But I didn't care. It was fun. It was fun climbing around up there. It was like the biggest set of monkey bars you could ever have. But eventually I started believing them. After telling me that over and over and over again, I began to become afraid of being up high. And I remember I was probably 14 or 15 years old. My dad and I were working on the barn, and we were hanging this door way up at the top of the hayloft, and it was 3 or 4 stories above the ground, and we had this kind of rickety, sketchy aluminum ladder. And my dad said, I want you to climb up there, and I want you to reach over, and I want you to tighten the bolts on the hinge on that door from the outside. And so I got about 3/4 of the way up the ladder, about 3 or 4 stories off the ground, and I'm looking down, and I couldn't go any further. My dad is standing at the bottom of the ladder. Now, there's a lot of things my dad could have said, like, hey, dirtbag, keep going. You're not done. You know, he could have cajoled me. He could have yelled at me. He could have said, you know, I didn't put you up there to be a big baby or whatever. But you know what my dad said? When I was afraid, I was too afraid to go any further, he said, I got you. I got you. You're going to be okay. I'm not going to let you fall. And that was enough. I was still frightened. I was still nervous. I was still uncomfortable. But I took my dad at his word. That was enough. I didn't need explanations. I didn't say, well, how are you going to do that? If I fall, we're both going to die. Because I'm going to land on you, and it's not going to go well. I didn't say, you know, hey, what are you going to go buy a new ladder? What? No, okay. You got this? I'll believe you. I don't think we should be people who are afraid of our circumstances, who because of our fear of our situation or because of the season that we're in, thinking that it's never going to end or it's never going to get any better, that bullies us into doubt or anger with God. There's a second lesson I'm trying to learn from the life of Joseph here in Genesis 40, and that is that sometimes I can be afraid, and I shouldn't be afraid. I shouldn't be afraid of the truth, because my fear of the truth sometimes bullies me into denial or avoidance. Don't let your fear of the truth bully you into denial or avoidance. I mean, do you ever do that? You ever been afraid of the truth? You ever been afraid you were out of money, so when your bank statement comes, you don't look at it? Because if you don't look at it, that means there's got to be money in there, right? If you don't balance your checkbook, does anybody balance a checkbook anymore? I do. And there are times when money is tight, when I'm procrastinating. I don't want to look at it. I kind of figure it's kind of like a child hiding under a blanket from the boogeyman. If I'm under the blanket, the boogeyman won't see me. If I don't balance my checkbook, there's going to be money in there, right? I mean, it's like when you're on a diet and you kind of let things go for a while. What do you avoid? Obviously not the cheeseburger or the pizza, but what do you avoid? You avoid the scale, because the scale is going to tell you the truth. And you're like, well, if I don't step on the scale, then I know I didn't gain weight. When you have to have a hard conversation with someone, and you have to tell them the truth, you have to tell them something that you know will make them uncomfortable. How easy is it to be passive aggressive about avoiding that person and finding other things to talk about or finding other places to be? Am I the only person that this happens to? Am I the only person who finds himself confronted by the truth and uncomfortable with it and says, well, because I'm afraid of that truth, I'm going to avoid it, or I'm going to deny it? I think it happens to more people than we realize. I think it happens to most of us, if not all of us. Didn't happen to Joseph. Joseph had some hard truth to tell. I mean, Joseph was not afraid of the truth, and he didn't need to deny its reality. When the two men came to him and told him their dreams, the cupbearer was easy. Oh, I can interpret that. I can tell you that. I can tell you what's going to happen. In 3 days, you're going to be restored, and everything is going to be just as it was. But he had to tell the baker his story. What do you think went through his head when he realized what the baker's dream meant? It gives us no indication that he hesitated at all, that he was afraid of the truth. He said, well, you want to know what this means? Here's the truth. The truth is that this means in 3 days, you're going to be executed. You're going to be dead in 3 days. And the birds are going to pick at your bones. Who wants to deliver that kind of message? I mean, to some extent, Joseph showed no fear of the truth, of avoiding it or denying it. He didn't let his fear of the truth bully him into denial. He didn't let his fear of his circumstances bully him into doubt. And then there's another observation in this story. He didn't let his fear, he didn't let his fear of waiting, he wasn't afraid of the wait. And he didn't let that bully him into discouragement or disappointment. We don't know how long he waited. We don't know. We don't know whether he was imprisoned for 5 years or 10 years. We don't know whether these events happened within 2 or 3 days of each other, or they were separated by weeks or months or years. We only know that when he made the interpretation, he knew that 3 days later there would be a celebration, and that's what he told them. He told them, in 3 days you're going to go, and the cupbearer will be restored, and the baker will be executed. And so Pharaoh threw a party. And at the party, they came, and the cupbearer was restored, and the baker was executed, just as he said. And then it tells us that after the 3 days, when you thought the wait was over, he had said, remember me, don't forget me. When you go see Pharaoh, don't remember me. It tells us at the end of the story that the cupbearer, once he was restored, never gave Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. And what we'll see next week was it would be 2 years. Genesis 41 begins 2 years later. 2 years every day, day after day, for 2 years, he remained forgotten in the dungeon of Pharaoh. You know what that feels like? You know what the waiting feels like? Because it is when this gets real. It is when fear gets amplified. It's in the stillness, in the in-between times, in the waiting. Do you remember what it was like when you were first left at home alone, when you were old enough and your parents went out and they said you're going to stay home alone? Remember what your house sounded like when you were there alone for the first time? Every creak, every groan, every sound was like, what was that? What was that? Because our fear is amplified in the waiting. Our fear is magnified in the stillness. I remember a number of years ago, our daughters were teenagers. My youngest daughter was 13, and Leah was 15, and Kaya was 17. Diane and I were at some function, and we left the girls at home alone, and my two oldest daughters, and I didn't realize this about girls. I thought it was just brothers would do this to each other. But girls can do it. You really can be mean. It's not a gender thing. You got mean in your bones. And my two older daughters said, well, okay, Caitlin, you're old enough, you're 13. And she was there with a friend of hers, a classmate of hers. She said, we're going to go out and we're going to go to the gym and you stay here alone. We had never left her alone before. I mean, part of it was she had two older sisters, so she had built-in babysitters. But at 13, that was kind of right on the cusp. And as far as I know, we had never left her alone. And so her two sisters take off. We didn't know about this. And so they go out. My oldest daughter was old enough to drive. They drive to the gym. They get to the gym is closed. So they decide, in the sisterly fashion, to come home and play a trick on their baby sister. And so my oldest daughter climbs up on the roof of our two-story house and starts knocking on the windows on the second story. And my daughter, my youngest daughter, and her friend, who are both 13, are in the house petrified. And then my middle daughter runs down and rings the doorbell and runs away. So my youngest daughter comes to the door, sees no one, hears a knocking on the door, calls 911. So my two older daughters, as the police are rolling up on our house, hightail it out of there. They're nowhere to be found. And my youngest daughter comes to the door, and she answers the door and explains to the police officers what's happened, and they do a search of the house, and they check it out. And as they're about to leave, they say, it must have just been the wind. To which my 13-year-old daughter gave the greatest response in childhood history. She said, the wind does not ring doorbells. It's in the waiting that our fear is amplified. Don't let our fear of the waiting, don't let your fear that this may last longer than I want, this may take longer than I want, I may not get there as soon or as easily as I want. Don't let the fear of that discourage you, disappoint you, depress you, or worse. See, I think this is where the hard work takes place. This is where we have to listen. This is where we have to look. This is where we have to hear God. And this is where I believe we have an advantage. We have a tendency to think that Joseph had an advantage. Well, Joseph heard God. Joseph interpreted dreams. Joseph was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But we actually have more advantages than Joseph did. We actually know more about the character of God than Joseph did. We have more promises than Joseph ever had. That's why Jesus kept telling his followers, kept telling his disciples, kept telling us, don't be afraid. In John chapter 14, he says, my peace I give to you, my peace I leave with you. And I don't give you a peace as the world gives. It's a different kind of peace. So don't let your heart be troubled. And do not be afraid. And what he wasn't saying when he said that was, I got you. I'm with you. Now, I don't know if Joseph knew that God was with him. I don't know if he had bouts of doubt. I don't know if he struggled with denial. I don't know if he struggled with discouragement. But as I read through the story in Genesis chapter 40, and I read between the lines, I see the example of someone who didn't allow himself to be bullied by fear. He didn't allow his fear of his circumstances or fear of the truth or fear of the difficulty of the wait. He didn't allow those things to bully him. And what I try to take away is I try not to let those things create doubt or denial or avoidance or discouragement or despair in me. As we're walking around through this biography, through the life of Joseph, and we're looking for evidence of what it means to live a life of faith in a culture of bullies, we're looking straight into the fears that we have, and we all have them. We all have lots of fears. I could make a grocery list of the things that I'm concerned about, the things that I'm anxious about, the things that I'm afraid of. My vocabulary is punctuated with the phrase, well, I'm afraid I can't do this, or I'm afraid of that. Fear is a normal part of the human experience. To some degree, fear actually is like fire. Fear can be useful. Fear can warn us. Fear can protect us. Just like fire can warm a room, can light the dark, can help us with cooking and manufacturing. But when it's out of control, it's destructive. And when fear becomes overwhelming, when fear gets out of control and it paralyzes us, it bullies us. Fear can be a bully. And what I see from the life of Joseph was that he did not let his fear bully him. So maybe the question isn't, what are you afraid of? Maybe the right question to ask today is, how long are you going to let fear push you around? I don't know about you, but I think we live among enough bullies. We don't need to add another one. Don't let fear bully you. Don't be afraid. He's got this.